Welcome to 65 Drums. My name's Justin Greenewalt, and this is the story of electronic drums. The whole concept of E-drums has only existed for about 55 years, but they've already made an indelible mark on the world of music. Everybody knows about the really big companies, like Simmons, Roland, Yamaha, and Alesis, but you're going to learn about dozens of other companies you've never even heard of before and why they mattered. This is the history of electronic drums. The 60s will be the shortest decade to cover because this is when the innovators first started experimenting with electronics. No companies actually existed yet to sell electronic drums yet. Alright, so let's talk about Mate-Z. Manufactured in Milan, Italy during the 60s, their Mate-Z Hollywood Tronic drum is the first known acoustic electronic hybrid drum set. Thankfully, someone uploaded a scan of these advertisements to drumarchive.com, which explains the different parts and pieces of the drum set. It's written in Italian, but also has a very helpful English translation under each paragraph. This kit was advertised as the future of drumming. Each piece, except for the hi-hat, came on rollers. Each wheel was on a movable arm to transport or stabilize it in place, and two of them could be height adjusted. The tom and snare stands had nylon ball joints, and the set was outfitted with acoustic heads because this was an acoustic drum set. The Hollywood Tronic drum brain was mounted to the right side of the drums. On the face, you had control over the volume of each drum, octave controls, normal, medium, and treble buttons, and 4 snare effect buttons. That pedal on the ground that looks like a hi-hat controller is used to adjust the volume. There were electrical components inside of each drum with 1/4-inch cables coming out the air vents that went to the drum brain, except for the kick drum that used a 5-pin connection on the side of the shell. We can piece together different parts of this drum set, but not much is really known about its origins, or even an exact year that it came out. Interestingly enough, one came up for sale by Wood & Feather Vintage Drum Shop. On their Reverb store, they listed it for $2,250. They posted these excellent HD color images from every angle, in and outside of the drum, so you can see the electronics in detail. This is a really good find, because most other Hollywood Tronic drums from this era have a component missing, usually the drum brain. This one has everything and is in decent shape for what it is. There's also a rough playthrough that you can hear on the Wood & Feather YouTube channel, and I'll share a little clip of it right here. In 1964, Felix Visser modified an Acetone rhythm box into an early drum brain of sorts, with some drum triggers to activate certain sounds within the box on each hit. This way, you could actually play whatever sound you wanted at will instead of playing the pre-programmed beat loops inside. And by the way, the inventor of the Acetone rhythm box was Akutaro Kakahashi, who would later start a company called Roland. And that's it for the 60s. Now it's time to move on to the 70s. While there have been a lot of different cases of what could be called electronic drums before the 70s, such as that modified Acetone rhythm box, the Hollywood Tronic hybrid drum set, and possibly even some drum pads that would plug into keyboard synthesizers for one-man bands. But many people credit this man with being the inventor of the first true electronic drums, whatever true electronic drums means. In 1971, Moody Blues drummer Graham Edge and Professor Brian Groves from Sussex University designed the earliest drum pads. These were early triggers with a rubber slab over top of them. You can actually hear the setup being played on the song Procession from the album Every Good Boy Deserves Favor. To be honest, this is a very weird, trippy song, but it's really cool to hear the first electronic drums in action, because these are the very first recorded electronic drums. I can't show you very much of the song due to copyright reasons, but here's a very short clip. As with many prototypes, this one unfortunately fell apart. Another important band from the early days of electronic drums is Kraftwerk. Wolfgang Flür, a drummer for the German band, created a custom electronic multipad which triggered sounds from a modified rhythm box. He would go on to win an award for this in 2012. The performance that you're seeing right here is from 1973. In another performance in 1975 on BBC Tomorrow's World, we can get a better look at the multipad. It may have changed slightly since 1973 as well. Here you can see that they're using a modified Farfisa Rhythm 10 box as the sound source, and they created two separate multipads. As you can see, lead wires are running from the drumsticks over to the rhythm box, and I assume a circuit is completed every time they hit one of the metal zones. Possibly the first ever commercially sold electronic drum was the Impact Percussion synthesizer. This was created by Steve Lamy in 1971. He worked on it for a few years until he started selling it in 1973. He initially invented it so his son wouldn't have to play so loud during practice. That's really one of the core reasons electronic drums are still sold today, come to think of it. In addition to the Impact Percussion synthesizer, there was also the Impact Tunable Tom-Tom. Unfortunately, none of these products really sold very well. That same year, the synthesizer company Moog came out with the Moog percussion controller at a price of about $265 retail. The drum pad was built from a Pearl drum body and then filled with Moog electronics. The system interfaced with Moog synthesizers such as the Mini Moog Satellite. Jumping ahead about 3 years to 1976, we have Star Instruments. Based out of Connecticut, Moore Milliard's Star Instruments hit the scene with the Snare 1, selling for about $795. This is possibly the first ever commercial multipad. The Snare 1 had 4 zones, and the drum brain was built into the top of the system, where you could control the low-pass filter, LFO controls, ring modulator, pink noise, white noise filter area, and more. Star Instruments came out with a successor the very next year called the Snare 2. This time with 4 times as many zones and a much larger $1,395 price tag. The number of pads was chosen to let you control an entire octave, and the drum brain had a whole sequencer section. That same year, Pollard Industries hit the scene with the Pollard Syndrome's Model 447. This company was founded by one of the drummers for the Beach Boys, Joe Pollard and Mark Barton from California. Unfortunately, this original iteration of the company was very short-lived, and it sold its assets to Research Development Systems, Inc. In 1978, we saw the brief introduction of the Calto Thinskins. They were selling for about $260. This system was designed by the man behind the Regal Tip drumsticks, Joe Calto. Not many drum sets were sold. In that same year, Pollard Industries was reborn as Pollard International under its new owner. The 447 was upgraded with several improvements and turned into the 478 Quad, which was the flagship model of this new company. The Model 278 Twin and the Model 178 Single variants were also added to the company's offerings as well. These were smaller units with less drums and less features, which made them, I assume, more affordable. The CM178 also had the same body as the other pads that Pollard created, but now with a drum brain built in. These were very small pads, but a lack of a separate drum brain made them even more portable. It sold for about $150 and eventually got down to $80. There were a few famous drummers that used Pollard drums, including drummers for The Cars, Toto, and Frank Zappa. Alright, let's take a second to talk about the sound profile of a lot of these early 70s electronic drums. The best way I can describe the Pollard sound palette is classic arcade video games. That's really the exact sounds that you were hearing every time you hit these pads. And because this is a synthesizer for drums, you could manipulate the sounds at will. There was also a pedal that you used to control aspects of the sound as well. By the way, if you really want to hear more playing examples of these drums, check out the channel Retro Drum for video examples. He does an excellent job over there. In 1978, what might be the first of many electronic drums from Japan came out, the Alt Sound DS4 Pro Moser. The drum brain opened up like a suitcase, and there were 4 circular drum pads. The next year they released the DS2, which featured a funky plastic-covered lid with pads on it. Now, something else really important happened in 1978. We saw the introduction of Musicade. This company was founded by a technician and a salesman from the company Bawsey and Hawks. When the company's electronics division closed down, Dave Simmons and Ray Kitchen partnered up to create a new company, Musicade. Musicade was not a drum company specifically. They sold and repaired musical instruments in general. Dave Simmons was tinkering on different electronic drums for a while, the first being the original Simmons drum synthesizer, and then an improved version with a chassis that you could say was the SDS-1. Then there was an improved version, the SDS-2, now with a run generator and memory. However, those weren't sold. They were just experiments and prototypes. The first official drum from the company was the Musicade Simmons SDS-3. It might be hard to tell, but these shells are actually made from tambourine shells from the drum company Premier, featuring massive 2.5-inch speakers inside which acted as the pickups. The heads and hardware holding it all together were from a company called Everplay. This system was fairly expensive though, so after about a year, a less expensive SDS4 version came out with just 2 pads and a smaller drum brain. The Musiccade drums would sell very well in Europe and to a lesser extent in America. Musiccade was the beginning of what would become an absolute powerhouse in electronic drums just a few years later.
Dave Simmons, the inventor and of the technology, runs the company. Dave, how did you start?
Well, like Bill, I was slogging around the circuit in various unknown groups. And the group I was playing with, we had a drummer naturally, and he was pretty bored with hitting dead animal skins. So, being interested in electronics and music, I put together something that he could play and we could make some nice sounds with.
1979 Paya. Manufactured in the United States, the electronics company Paya sold a drum brain system with up to 4 individual drum modules inside its casing. Each module was sold separately for about $60 each, or you could buy the whole set for about $270. It was meant to be used with drum triggers that would connect to the module and then placed on a drum. And it is not exactly clear if those were actually included with the product or if you'd have to source one yourself. In 1979, Star Instruments released the Snare 3. This unit was a similar idea to the Syndrum CM. It was an all-in-one system with inside a pad, powered by 2 9-volt batteries. It turned on when you plugged in an audio cable and started playing on it. The Snare cost about $225 and was the most popular pad Star Instruments would ever make. It would spawn a pile of subsequent pads from the company, and it was made to be used with the Snare sequencer. That same year, they also came out with the Snare Instruments sensor. This is one of the earliest commercially available drum triggers. You'd clip it onto your snare or tom and instantly have electronic sounds at your fingertips, along with a decent set of sound controls and a foot switch if needed. A very similar unit was later made by Korn. Let's talk about Tama for a second. While many drummers first thought of Tama in the electronic drum space is probably the Techstar line, Tama's first jump into the world of electronic drums is actually the Sniper. This system consisted of the DS200 brain and 2 triggers that you would place on an acoustic drum. These were contact pickups. Stuart Copeland was known to use this system, and Tama also released the DS2000, which had more inputs. In 1979, Pearl jumped into E-drums with the Syncussion SY1. This setup generated very interesting sounds compared to the competition at the time. It had 2 inputs for small tom-style pads, and they used dead-end acoustic heads with triggers inside. It was also said that you could just connect a few microphones to the inputs to act as triggers as well. So that is the second shortest decade that we're going to be covering in today's video. That is it for the 70s. We have the earliest electronic drums. They didn't sound that amazing. They were a little bit rough around the edges, but now we're about to enter what many people call the golden age of electronic drums, the 1980s.
Quite simply brings drums into the 80s.
So let's take a break from the main timeline to talk about what all these different control knobs or pots on the face of the different drum brains did, because this is the heart of early electronic drums. This is what made them tick. And even today, the drum brains go for a lot more than the drum pads. Now here's a chart with all the definitions, but that's boring just to read by itself. So let me demonstrate via a really cool drum plugin that I just bought. Alright, so this is like the classic sound that I associate with electronic drums of the 80s. Now let's go through the different tone controls one by one. So let's start off with the snare drum and switch this to full module view. Let's, change the tone a little bit. This is a pitch control knob. Alright, now let's move ahead and start messing with the noise control. Noise really makes or breaks the snare sound of a lot of these early electronic drum brains. You can give your sound more or less bite this way. Next up is the bend control. You can have it bend downward or upward here. So that's that classic do sound. Next up is decay. How long do you want the sound to ring out? Next up is click. By the way, this is not a full complete list of every kind of shaping tone control out there. There was a lot of variation in the early days of electronic drums, but at least this gives you an idea of how you would shape and mold the sound that you were trying to go after. Okay, so let's jump into 1980, Star Instruments. They doubled down on the snare pad this year with a lot of new variants. The Snare 3 was updated to the S3X. This new version came in white and black heads. It let you store presets. It was thinner. It had a sensitivity knob. At the same time, they also released the Snare S4 variant, which had a real drum head and was more sensitive. This version needed external power, didn't run off batteries. There was also a kick drum variant, the Star Instruments electronic bass at $300. There was also the Star Instruments timpani version for $325, which did exactly like what it was named. King Crimson used this pad. And also the low tom, high tom variants were also sold for about $300. Next up is one of the most important electronic drum sets of all time. The last time that we covered Musicade was with the SDS3 and the SDS4. The SDS3 was still selling quite a few units. But Dave Simmons wasn't just sitting around. He had a problem that he had to solve. Drummers were getting tired of the types of electronic drum sounds that drum brains were producing at the time. People were just getting bored. So Dave Simmons solved this problem by making the drum modules sound significantly better with the introduction of the SDS5.
You're about to hear just some of the sounds that can be produced by the world's first electronic drum kit, the Simmons. The Simmons is capable of an infinite range of percussion sounds, limited only by your imagination. It quite simply brings drums into the 80s.
With inside this new drum brain, all the individual drum modules became dual channel, and thankfully the triggering problems of older generations were fixed with new pads. With the SDS5, they made the switch to piezos instead of the older style pickups. The company also began using plastic to use in the mount clamps to avoid crosstalk between the different pads. The drum pads were designed to look futuristic, stand out, and be easy to mass produce. This was the first full-size electronic drum set from the company.
I'm sure you've been asked this question 100 times. The drum devices themselves, why are they hexagonal and not round?
I've also been asked about 6 times in rehearsal this, but same story. We couldn't afford a circular saw, so we bought a straight saw instead. But no, seriously, anybody that sees the hexagonal shape on TV knows it's a Simmons kit, and that's, as a company, what we want.
The original iterations were made from lacquered wood bodies. The super hard playing surface was also done deliberately by Dave. It was decided that people liked the feel of drumming on countertops and hard surfaces with drumsticks. Which is true. It's fun to play on a countertop for about 5 minutes, but it becomes painful over the long haul. The so-called drummer's elbow. It was also very loud. A few drummers would actually throw rubber sheets over top of the surface to reduce noise while recording. The SDS5 also didn't have a headphone jack, so to hear themselves, drummers would just have to listen to it through the main PA speakers that they plugged into. Electronic drums were made by hand. Everything wasn't set in stone. Small improvements were made and variations were done to the design over the years of its production. It should also be mentioned that Dave Simmons credited Richard Burgess in helping him design the sound palette of the SDS5. Richard also helped generate interest in the Simmons brand name. In a book written in 1985 about electronic drums, it was pointed out that after interest in the Sin drum and the snare fell off, electronic drums as a whole went through a very quiet period of less popularity. The Simmons SDS5 brought that interest back tenfold. I cannot overemphasize how important this electronic drum set was in E-drum history. This drum set would eventually become so popular that it would spark an avalanche of competing drum sets for years. The SDS5 drum module had the sound that everybody wanted. Sometimes bands would record an album with an acoustic drum set and then rent a Simmons drum set and dub that over for the record. Meanwhile, some drummers were buying the drum set just because it looked cool, buying the drum set more for sculpting the image of the band more than its sound. Electronic drums were definitely a fad at this time. It made your band look more modern to have an electronic drum set on stage. Overall, the SDS5 is the core reason why electronic drums became popular in the 80s. It should also be mentioned that this drum set took a few years to gain traction, and for the company to be able to ramp up production. The drum set was not an overnight success, but as it slowly found its way into different famous music videos, it became an icon. By the way, as a side note, I should probably mention there were a lot of prototypes and limited edition runs with a few other shapes, including hearts, bat wings, and oh yeah, there was also those human heads. Tokyo Gaki, the company behind the Alt Sound DS2 from 1978, made an all-new all-in-one drum pad called the Asima OD3. There's also a long string of very similar pads that look like this coming out of Japan in the first few years of the 1980s, but we're not going to cover all of them in this video. In 1981, First Man released the Simplus SD1. This sold for a few years until about 1983. They also sold a similar pad under the Multivox MX57 Electro Snare name. In 1981, Star Instruments released the Snare MP, which was introduced at NAMM this year, but unfortunately never officially came out because the company went out of business. The man who designed this, Bill Katowski, bought the rights and then sold a few units later on. He would also go on to found the company Cat Inc. Star Instruments was later taken over by Fred Gretsch. While fairly rare to find, in 1981, Musicade released the Simmons Suitcase, or also called the Simmons Briefcase in at least one advertisement. The Simmons Suitcase was a multipad add-on for the Simmons SDS5 module. It was made to be versatile. You could use it for overdubbing in the studio or even live use. You could play it with your hands or drumsticks. It was really a suitcase with a bunch of foam cutouts for tiny Simmons pads. Unfortunately, there was a lot of crosstalk because they were so close together, they would trigger sounds from the other pads. Also, the playing surface was very fragile. It would break sometimes. Unfortunately, 1981 was also the year that Musicade went out of business, but I'll go more in depth on that in the 1982 section talking about Simmons.
I've got a few here. I can just tap.
In 1981, Mattel also took a crack at electronic drum multipads with the Sensonics Drum Model 5281, and possibly the Rhythm Maker 2 years later. It was announced but may or may not have actually been produced. Apparently the 5281 looked cool in ads but was kind of disappointing in real life when you actually got to play one. Under that Sensonics brand name, but now distributed by Gretsch, a Model 5300 drum set came out, very similar to the Gretsch ED700. And also a multipad called the 5350 came out in 86. Later they would also come out with a 5450 in 88 with built-in speakers. I ran through their different pads all in one go because, to be honest, Mattel really didn't make a big impact on electronic drums. Let's take a break for a second and talk about 1982. This is a very important year because this is the year that the MIDI standard was first announced. A group of music instrument manufacturers would gather to hammer out a new official MIDI standard, the detailed MIDI 1.0 spec, and publish it in 1985. MIDI would become the cornerstone of all future drum brains and modules. It would often become a killer feature that would sway potential buyers from one drum set to another. MIDI 1.0 proved to be so adaptable and so powerful that MIDI 2.0 wouldn't come out until the year 2020. So in 1981, Musicade, the company founded by Dave Simmons and Ray Kitchen, ran into money issues and the company went bankrupt. Apparently the fate of that company was on a razor's edge. They could have been saved, but they just ran out of money. Out of this mess, with the help of Dave's wife Christy, a new company called Clipfinch was born. But they quickly switched that name over to Simmons Electronics and began business in 1982. Thankfully, this brand new company had a strong product to lean on right away, the Simmons SDS5 drum set. Success doesn't happen instantly though. Back when the SDS5 was first being sold by Musicade, the company was building them very slowly with a small team. They weren't mass producing them yet. That would soon change though. Simmons eventually went from making 10 drum sets a month to 400 a month. And with the rising popularity of the drum sets, these kits were actually being sold before they were even being produced. Another product from this year was the SDS6. It was a drum machine that was made to interface with the SDS5. This didn't have any internal sounds of its own, but it let you bypass needing to use the drum pads if you didn't want to use them. Simmons spent a lot of money designing this and on the very expensive screen that it featured.
Great. What is that doing?
This is a computer which hits the drum rather better than Bill does.
Don't hit him, Bill.
1982 was also the year that Simmons began using plastic shells instead of wooden shells for their drum pads. These acrylic shells were actually clear, so all you had to do was paint the inside of the shell and the color would show through to the other side. This allowed them to come out with a lot of different color and gradient options. Apparently, white and black were some of their best-selling colors, and green didn't sell very well. Simmons' next product was a cymbal. It came with a plastic cymbal and also a separate cymbal module you'd have to add to your SDS5. It used a very short sample of a cymbal mixed with filters and analog tones to make it sound longer. Memory was really expensive. You couldn't just record 30 layers of round-robin samples at a 20-second duration back then. For the early Simmons ride cymbals, the sound triggered from the bow zone was a sample, and the bell zone was triggering an analog sound instead. There was also a very early hi-hat pedal for the click sound. Okay, so now it's time to talk about a brand new electronic drum company. MPC Electronics has had an interesting evolution in electronic drums. But to clear up any confusion, MPC is not related to the Akai brand of MPC MIDI controllers. Googling information about this company is kind of difficult, kind of like how it's hard to find out information about drum tech with an H when drum tech with a C exists. MPC Electronics entered the electronic drum scene with what they simply called the kit. This was a drum brain with built-in pads on the front of it that you'd play with your fingers. Created by Mike Coxhead, the kit was a relatively inexpensive 150 pounds. The original version was short-lived. They would go on to completely redesign the kit into a new version with 4 foam pads for the drums and 3 metal pads for the cymbals. There were also some cool add-ons for this as well. This new version was very successful. Over 10,000 of these were sold in just the first year alone. One review at the time from Electronic and Music Maker magazine called the kit revolutionary. Another said the kit caused quite a storm in the industry. During one interview by Electronics and Music Maker magazine, the owner and founder of the company said, "The reaction over there was incredible. It made me realize that I was right, that the risk was worth it. All along I knew that it was a gamble, but it excited me and I felt like, given the right marketing possibilities, it could be a very serious contender to the Japanese. But from a businessman's point of view, I was very naive when I first started the electronics business. I had no grounding in factories or making any sort of hardware. I thought that you just got the components together, built the units, and then started marketing them. I also thought that if you were unlucky, you might get 50% back for repairs. In the event, it was nothing like that. We originally had the casings made in Israel because that was the only place you could get them delivered fast enough. They were a disaster and we had to find a UK maker to take over. Then the parts were late. It was hair-raising. Alright, let's move ahead to MCS. This company didn't make a full drum set or even drum pads, but I should probably mention them because they made the Movement Computer Systems. They came out with 2 computers, the Movement Percussion Computer and the Mark II. These were meant to be used with whatever kind of drum pads that you liked. Electronic drum pads back then were very simple and were compatible with each other. They all pretty much just used one piezo. That second module was very expensive at a whopping 2,300 pounds. In 1983, the Japanese Bias brand released the BNT6 Night Training drum set. To me at least, this kit aged very well in the looks department because it used acoustic half shells in a full-sized acoustic kick drum. The module had 6 channels and a more electronic-looking sequel would be released the following year. 1983 Simmons. They sponsored a racing team this year. Just thought I'd put that out there. In 1983, MPC released a multipad called the MPC-1, which sold for about 600 pounds. It was originally going to be called the Kit 2, even though it probably should have been called the Kit 3, but they decided that this was different enough from their old pads to get its own naming scheme. The MPC unit itself is basically the next generation on from the Kit. In the early days, we always harbored an idea for a much bigger unit that could be played with drumsticks. We also had specific ideas on what the unit was supposed to do. We especially wanted to be able to take in a whole pattern of drums and then replay them, while the pads were being played over top of them. Although this was still designed to be played with your fingers, the larger playing sizes signified a move towards the domain of drumsticks. Let's talk about Clone Kit. The Clone Kit was designed by Dick Straker and Pete Brewer. This first drum set was a modified set of Remo RPS-10 practice pads plus a drum brain. As you played the drum set, it responded to how hard you hit by bending the pitch. The snare sound also had a white noise control to set it apart from the rest of the synth sounds. There was also a handy out for the kick drum so you could potentially EQ it separately somewhere else. This drum set was very cheap at 300 pounds. Only 120 units were made. Later that year they came out with the second version called the Clone Kit 2, this time with custom 8-sided pads and a very deep design. And there was also a new module. Both of these drum sets set on very unique drum racks. This updated version cost about 500 pounds, significantly more expensive than the early run of Remo pads. Let's talk about Cactus for a second. This is a company that not many people remember from the early days of electronic drums. Based out of the UK and designed by Pete Kershaw, the company's first drum set was a Cactus Desert Kit. This company took the hybrid drum brain approach. They relied on samples for most of the sounds and one synth module for the classic electronic pew-pew sounds. The module was probably the best part of the drum set, with a sturdy metal chassis. The sample chips were on 64K RAM EEPROM chips, and the synth chip was an IC chip. There was even a channel for a metronome, but you kind of just had to source one yourself. This was just an aux input. The drum brain had individual modules. You could add up to 10. You would literally unscrew one of the plates and then add a new one in. The idea of acoustic samples were still a pretty new thing at the time. One reviewer, Paul White, said, "It's a bit weird at first, hitting a rubber-coated frisbee and getting back a realistic, expensive-sounding cymbal coming back at you through the speakers." The effect was probably helped because the sample length was decently long. This is especially important on cymbal sounds. The 30cm toms and snare and the 51cm kick drum pad are made of injection molded ABS plastic. The kick drum used a slightly less rigid composite material. The pads used XLR connections, and the playing surface was made of rubber. much better to play on than the solid plastic of a lot of other early electronic drum pads. The whole design was pretty lightweight. The set used tom stands to hold the pads, and reviewers praised its stability, except for the kick drum. One reviewer complained that it was prone to slipping. Reviewer Andy Duncan from 1-2 Testing magazine wrote, "The bass drum's two halves, front and back, were already beginning to part company, and in overall terms I couldn't say that the pads looked especially robust or impressive." Another complaint was about the 800-pound price tag, which was $50 more than the main competitor, the Simmons SDS-8. What you'll realize if you read a lot of these old reviews is that every single magazine review of any electronic drum set you can think of would bring up how it compares to the Simmons offering. Everyone was just judged by the Simmons standard because they were so well made. The Cactus Desert kit appeared to be a mixed bag overall, but I think it was very interesting in terms of design and the hybrid nature of the drum brain. Cactus would improve it in a future version. Let's move ahead to M&A. M&A is a brand of electronic drums owned by parent company Magic Music. They sold their first two drum sets in 1983, the M&A KB1 drum set for about 658 pounds, and a slightly cheaper K1 version for 598 pounds in 1983. The drum brain had 7 channels, and this first generation is very easy to recognize because of the rounded triangular design. They were mounted onto a very odd-looking drum rack / stand-looking thingy. The pads were red with a transparent polycarbonate head zone and a black wood and metal finish. The pads had two main advantages: portability because of the small size, and the fact that the K1 was decently inexpensive at the time. To me at least, it mainly suffered in the looks department compared to the competition in 1983. 1983 is also our first look at Clavia. Clavia was founded and made the digital percussion Plate 1. This was deemed an instant success by Clavia and would lead them to create the D-Drum brand for future products. So essentially 1983 is the beginning of D-Drum. This next drum set, I'm a little bit uncertain about the exact year that it came out, but this is the Digiplay ED505S, another hexagon pad looking kit to nab some of Simmons' sales, with a relatively minimalist drum module that only had 5 channels. Another drum set from 1984 is Cano. This is the Cano Modulus, a short-lived drum brand that unfortunately did not get updated. Moving ahead with a brand that you have heard of before but probably didn't expect to see again, we have the Gretsch Blackhawk ED700 drum set. It sold for $1,000 and featured the ED700 drum brain. The whole thing was basically a Digiplay ED505S and a Sensonics 5300 drum set under a different name. MFB is one of the more obscure German electronic drum companies. They released quite a bit of hardware. There was the MFB 1001, the 1005, the 2001, the 2002, the 2005, and the 712.